7 crucial things that everybody has missed about the Will Smith and Chris Rock slapping incident, including why we're all looking in the wrong place, how there is more than one Will Smith, and the secret that you are probably not going to want to know about why we get offended by things and how you can solve it. And I'm going to show you how all of these lessons we can learn can help you to solve all of the problems in your life. Welcome to the show. I'm Paul Cope, and ordinarily I talk about the root causes of all of the problems in your life and how you can solve them. I don't usually get involved in the world of celebrity nonsense for reasons I'll go into at the end of this episode if you want to hear more. But the Will Smith and Chris Rock thing happened. It was sent to me a while ago now. I very much did not want to jump on the bandwagon. I did not want to get into the world of hot takes. And having reflected on it all and watched it a few times and taken the step to listen to his autobiography, because I think that's crucial in this, it's just too big an opportunity to turn down. Because what I've realised is in this 1 minute high profile video, I can basically give you a summary of the vast majority of the work I do that has changed my life and I've helped coach people around the world with. And I can show you it step by step rather than talking about it theoretically. So it can be really, really powerful. And I can show you how it applies to your life and how the lessons we can take from it can help you to solve problems. So it was too big an opportunity to turn down. If you've listened to or watched anything I've done before, you will know I can and do talk about all of this stuff for hours on end. So this is going to be a short overview of all of the different things that apply to this incident. If you like it and if you want more detail and more free content, I will link to it all as the video progresses, as the episode progresses, and in the description in the show notes below. So stick around for that. So let's get stuck straight into it. The first crucial thing that everybody has missed, and it's the same thing that everybody misses all the time, including me in years gone by and even now after all of the stuff I've learned, is that we're all looking in the wrong place, and we always are, or we tend to be. What the fuck am I talking about? The problem with any big incident in life, with anything in your life, with this incident, is that life is like a magic trick. I'll give you a very quick explanation of what I mean. With magic tricks, I loved magic growing up. I still love magic now. There was a point in my life where I started learning how to do all these different tricks. And something I realised whilst doing this work is, and changing my life, one of the problems is we're always looking in the wrong place. The world wants us to focus on the end of the trick. So whenever we're trying to figure out how a magician does a trick, we tend to look at the end of it. We tend to look at his hands. We tend to look at what's going on. The problem with that is, without ruining magic for you, is that most magic tricks are done long before you think they are. So when you're staring at a magician's hands trying to figure out how it's done, you'll never figure it out. And that's why we can't figure out most things in our life, most problems in our life, because we're looking in the wrong place. We're looking at the end of the trick instead of where it started. It's the same with this incident. Everybody is focusing on a 1 or 2 minute section of Will Smith's life that culminated in him slapping a fellow entertainer, comedian, on stage at the Oscars, and then sitting down and screaming abuse at him.
Keep my wife's name out your fucking mouth!
It's so easy to focus on that, which is why the world focuses on it. What I want to talk you through is what leads up to that point and how that affects your life and my life and how we can learn from that. So if we want to fully understand what's going on, we need to go deeper. We need to go back to the beginning of the trick, which is what takes us to the second crucial thing everyone's missed. Ultimately, we need to look at why we are the way we are in life. What has led to us becoming the person we are? What has led to the point where Will Smith has stood up on stage and smacked someone at the Oscars? As I say, it's so easy to focus on that one thing, but as soon as we can zoom out and go backwards in time and work through, we can get to the root of it, and that helps us to solve this stuff. So as I'm talking about this, and as you hear me talking about Will Smith and Chris Rock, think about your own life. Think about incidents in your life, anything maybe big or small, where you've been focusing on the end of the problem. So that may be you constantly argue with your partner about how untidy a table is, or you have a constant argument about the toaster or a microwave or the way the dishwasher is stacked, or you've got a problem with your boss in work or an employee and you're constantly focusing on the end, think about in this context as we go through. Where we come back to right at the beginning of all of this is the programming experiences we've had since we first entered this planet are what shape us today. So from the very first moment we came out kicking and screaming into this world, we've been getting programmed. We've had billions and billions of separate programming experiences, loads of them when we were a child. So the first thing we do when we come out is we get handed to these big ugly giants. We don't know what they're saying, we can't understand them, and they start to program us because we don't know how to be a human. So they start programming us with how to behave and how to operate in this big, scary world. In the case of Will Smith, if you listen to or read his autobiography that has only recently been released, it's really apparent from the very start that he has had a huge amount of programming in his life that led to him feeling like a coward. In particular, in relation to his mum and not protecting his mum from his dad, who was sometimes abusive. It is a theme that runs throughout his entire life. The feeling of cowardice, of being a coward, of not being man enough. And also on top of that, that he had a role to protect people that has developed over time. And it's that programming that takes us to the third crucial thing, which is one of the most powerful things I've ever learned, and the people I coach love, and it helps to transform their life. So see if this resonates with you. And that is that there's more than one Will Smith. What the fuck are you talking about, Paul? I hear you cry if you've never heard me talk about this before. If you have, it'll be a nice refresher, and it'll be a nice little example to show you in real time with someone very, very famous how this stuff works. If you've never heard about this stuff before, this is a huge part of the work I've done. And when you first hear it, it can sound crazy. But the more you get into it, the more you learn about it, the more you learn about yourself, and then the more you see it in other people, the world starts to make a lot more sense. So where this all goes back to is the programming we've just been talking about. When you come out as a child, you start getting programmed. The real version of us usually and often struggles with this world. It struggles to survive. We are not built for the world we've been born into. So we have a control deck inside our head and a team of operators that operate this big system, this big, beautiful, complex system. And what it starts doing from the moment we're born is it starts to create new personas. It starts to create different aspects of us, new characters that can help us to survive in this world. The fascinating thing about Will Smith in this context is that he's actually done this work. He talks about his multiple personalities. There are interviews from years ago that I've seen him talk about Will Smith. The person we see as Will Smith is a character that he developed. You may have heard Jim Carrey talking about a similar thing. He's done a lot of this work. Jim Carrey is a character that he developed to survive in this world. He's the extroverted, outgoing movie star. Does that sound mad to you? Do you think, what are you talking about? Bring it back to your life. If you've never done this work, if you've never heard me talk about it, think about the different versions of you that exist in the world. The first time I heard about this, I was blown away by it. And the lady who was teaching me about it gave an example of, she liked to name the different characters, and she had one in her mind. One of her personas used to moan a lot. And she used to work with a lady called Sandra who moaned a lot, so she called that character Sandra. And she said, think about that and see if you can name the characters you've got. And for me back then, this is 5 years ago now, I remember thinking, I don't need to name them because my characters already had names. If you speak to anybody who knows me from my old life, the vast majority of them will call me Kopi. That was my nickname. Kopi was a character that I created. He was the extroverted character that helped me survive in a loud, extroverted world when deep down inside, I'm introverted. I was a shy little boy. I was very quiet growing up. I started to discover lots of these different versions. Think about your own life. Do you have a work version of you? Do you act differently with your spouse or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your partner? Do you act differently with your children? Even when you're with your children, are there different versions of you with your children? Are you sometimes fun parents, sometimes angry parents, sometimes strict parents? Are you different with your own parents, with your own family, with different groups of mates? You may find that you dress slightly differently. Your accent changes slightly when you're around different people. Does that resonate? This 100% happens with Will Smith. It happens with everybody. This applies to everybody. If you don't think it's you, we just need to look deeper to start to uncover it. Generally speaking, when I start talking to people about this, it pops out. Like, your first big characters pop out. I like to refer to those people as the rock star characters. These are the people who've become so prominent in our life that we see them all the time, often to our detriment, and often they'll be more prominent. Those characters will be more prominent than the real version of us, who we might have lost sight of over the years. This is what's happened with Will Smith. He has developed a whole host of characters, of personalities throughout his life to survive. Let me walk you through some of them. So some of them he actually names in the book. One is called Uncle Fluffy, who is his people pleaser persona. We all have this character, the people pleaser who wants everybody to like us, wants to be nice to everybody, doesn't want to upset anyone, doesn't want to say no to things. His is called Uncle Fluffy. He's got another one called the General, which is the flip side of his Uncle Fluffy. We'll go on to that more in a minute. As I say, there's also a big protector part of Will Smith, and this is something I hear a lot about, actually. Is you may have heard people talk about, you may have spoken about it yourself, the damage that Disney movies and things like that did to young women growing up, which is that they taught women subconsciously that they needed to be rescued by men, and that is not a healthy thing for them to learn, which I agree with 100%. The one thing I don't hear people talk about is what the damaging effect it had on young boys, because the damaging effect it had on young boys was that it taught us that we have to save women in particular in order to be worth something, which is unhealthy in itself. If you read Will Smith's book or listen to his book, you will see a pattern throughout his life of strong female presence, a strong desire from him to protect women and other people inside his life. If you look, just jumping ahead slightly, look at his Oscar acceptance speech, and you can see this in his speech. He refers to the need, the calling to protect people. This is big in his life, and there are different versions of this character. As I say, we could talk about this topic by itself for hours. I just want to run you through quickly how this works, right? So until we learn about this, and until our conscious mind can get a grip of all of these characters, remember, it's our subconscious system that's grown them, that's developed them over time. So what's happening until we consciously take control is our subconscious decides which character we need in which situation. The way I like to think of it is all of your characters are on a stage, like in a big stage play, and there's one microphone, and only one character can be on the mic at any one time. Now, the mic can pass hands and change hands quickly, but only one character is on the mic at any one time. Right now, in your life, unless you've been doing this work to take control of it, the mic passes subconsciously. The characters also, importantly, a lot of them have been developed to meet our needs and keep us alive, but they've been developed and they meet our needs in unhealthy ways. We haven't got time to get into the details of that. We'll be here all day. There is another video, there are other episodes of this on this channel that I'll link to in the notes in the description below that you can watch at the end of this if you want to see more of the detail of this. But the key for this is that the mic changes hands, so we effectively change personality throughout the day, through moments. I want to talk you quickly through what happens with Will Smith, using this work as a filter to look through as he goes through this whole stage. It's really, really fascinating to watch it happening live in the space of a minute or two. So the first one we see, which if you've been watching this, you'll see people have been talking about this. People love to focus on this, that when Chris Rock first cracks the joke that has caused the controversy, Will Smith laughs. And what people have taken from that is that's the real Will Smith. And there's an interpretation that it's Jada Pinkett Smith who has an influence on him and changes what he does. Maybe that's a part of it. That's not something we need to speculate too much about for the purposes of this. What's important to note is that is one of Will Smith's characters. Bear in mind the context, right? He's sitting at the front row at the Oscars. He is in full-on Will Smith, in inverted commas, mode. He is in the character mode. He is in the actor, the performer, the entertainer mode. That is what he's come to the Oscars as. In the same way that if I go out, if I go to a pub, if I go out to a club, if I'm going to a party, my copy character is the dominant one. Until I take conscious control of it, and that's something else we can talk about later, That is the dominant one, because that's the character that our system has created to thrive in that environment, or at least to survive in that environment. So in that moment, when that character's on the mic, it'll be tied to his Uncle Fluffy character. He wants to please people. He wants to entertain. If someone cracks a joke, he will laugh. There is a very good chance. Think about this yourself. If you're on the front row of a comedy gig, think of how much strength and courage it takes not to laugh at a joke. Even if you don't get it, you might not understand the joke and you'll still laugh. It's happened to me so many times in my life where I've laughed at a joke and then someone's gone to me, I don't get that, can you explain it to me? And I've thought, I don't get it either, I was just laughing to be nice. So in that split second moment, one character's on the mic. What we then see, and look, there'll be different things in this, but this is just like clear definitions between characters. What we then see is the character that stands up and walks to Chris Rock to slap him and then walks back. As I look at it, I think that's another character. It's a separate character, but the important thing is it's not the same character as the one who sits down. We're going to talk more about that in the next part. But the person who gets up to go and confront Chris Rock, to me, is still an entertainer character. The way he struts up, the way he's walking, his body language. And then, most importantly, even when I watched this live for the first time, when I saw him hit Chris Rock, what struck me straight away instinctively was that wasn't a real hit. Like, he didn't even slap him properly. It looked to me like a movie slap. Bearing in mind the context of all this, which we're going to talk more about later, this is an Oscar-winning actor now. Like, this is a seasoned pro. He has been in fight scenes. He has learned how to box in a fighting movie. That slap barely touched Chris Rock. Then, importantly, when he turns around and walks away, he's strutting. The look on his face, the smirk, the shoulders back. That is still an entertainer. That is still a performer. That, to me, strikes me as a protector character who is a light protector character. Something I realised in my life was I had light and dark versions of different characters. So Kopi, the extrovert, had a light version and a dark version. The light version everyone liked. He was nice and friendly and happy. The dark version was more wanted to stay out and drink and party. Two parts of the same thing. The protector character for Will Smith, I think would be split into more than one. That one is the light version. There's still a performance element to it. Then there's another shift. There's another mic change. Think about this in the characters swapping mics, right? So you've got the first character who's Will Smith, the entertainer, sitting down laughing. Then subconsciously, for whatever reason, the mic swap hands, goes to the light protector. Still an entertainer, but making a point of this isn't acceptable. When he sits back down and talks, when he opens his mouth, I'll link to the main video of this so you can watch it again in the context of this. Now that you've heard this, what we go into then is pure rage, and this is really important that we differentiate the difference between anger and rage.
Keep my wife's name out your fucking mouth!
I'm going to do a whole section on that in a second, but that is a rage character. That is not the same character that has just got up and strutted to the stage. It's a different one. If that rage character had been the one that hit Chris Rock would not have got up. Really important. So that's a third character we've seen. And remember, tying all of this together, the background of this, the programming that Will Smith has had since he was a kid, running right the way through his life, was a story in his own mind that he's a coward, that he never did enough to protect, especially his mum, one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent woman in his life. So there's an element behind all of this of a story in his own life of the need to protect people, to not be a coward. There will be an inner battle for him of trying to find some balance between these characters, and he's struggling right now, looking at the apology that came the next day that we'll come to later, that he's trying to find his way through this. He's trying to find, and this is part of this work. When you start doing this, it does not just magically get better. We need to find balance between the characters we've created subconsciously and who we actually want to be in real life. So there'll be an element in here of Will Smith consciously trying to do something to be more who he wants to be and losing track and losing balance of that a little bit along the way. Then we see another character, which is the one that accepts the Oscar and stands up and is in tears and is crying. This is quite common. I don't know what the time gap is between the slap and the Oscar win. I would guess it's quite a big period of time. So bear in mind that whole time he's been able to simmer on this and to think about it. There's a lot for me inside that Oscar winning speech. There's shame in there, there's guilt in there, there's remorse in there. He apologises. He doesn't apologise to Chris Rock, but he apologises to the Academy. He apologises to his fellow nominees. The language within that part we could talk about for hours. It's really, really interesting. Just to touch on it slightly in the middle of this personality stuff, he says a phrase that is so powerful. He says, "I've been called to love people." Something like that. I've been called to love people. He's in a highly emotive state. The language that we use that comes out of our mouth is really indicative of what's going on inside our heads. The phrase "I've been called to" is similar to language like "I must," "I should," "I need to." It's something I always look out for in my own life, and my coaching clients, we talk about stuff like this all the time. If you're using language like that, that is an external obligation. That language doesn't talk about stuff you want to do. It talks about stuff you feel like you have to do for some reason. Could talk about that for hours. Again, I've been called to love. And very importantly, the word people. For such a small word, it is so powerful in our lives. Whenever you find yourself in your life saying people, the best thing you can do is train yourself to ask this question next. Which people? Because we all do this. We'll all say, "I don't want to do this because I care what people think." If we stop and say, which people? There's 8.5 billion people on this planet. Do I care about what all of them think? When Will Smith says, "I've been called to love people," the most important thing in that is which people? Who is he talking about? Notice he doesn't say, "I love my wife." That is not what he says. He says, "I've been called to love people." The implication in that is he's been called to love, and then he talks about protection. He talks about protecting other people, which goes into this protector character. The language into that is really fascinating as well. There's too much to delve into in that for the purposes of this video. We can go into it in more detail in the future if you would like me to. Let me know in the comments if you want to hear more on that stuff. It was just worth touching on for the purpose of this. For the purpose of the multiple personality work, in that speech, when we're so emotional, it can let out our subconscious thoughts more. And what I think we're seeing there is more of the shame. What we tend to get on the other side of a rage character. So whenever a rage character hits the mic and just explodes, what tends to come on the other side of a rage character is rage character just drops the mic, and we often hit shame and guilt on the other side of that, because rage is not a healthy expression of ourselves. As I say, we're going to talk about that more in a second. So I think that's another character altogether. And then we see, away from the Oscars, the next day, he posted on social media an apology. And what we see there is a different character again. In that apology, he mentions Chris Rock and apologises to Chris Rock. Remorseful, balanced, calm. This all ties into the context, remember, as well, of what we're talking about. We're talking about high-level entertainers, actors, performers. We're talking about, on the next day, PR agencies potentially being involved. Obviously, lots of complex stuff. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes as well. But that, to me, is another character. It's a separate character altogether. So we've seen multiple parts of what we would call Will Smith, and we all just refer to him as though he's one person. And what I want to show to you by showing you each of those stages is how this operates in real life, the different versions of us. Think about that in your own life next time you're doing something. Think about it next time you're interacting with somebody else. Once you've learned this, I think the world starts to make a lot more sense. Think about it in a romantic situation. There are times when you will look at someone and you think they are madly in love with you, you're madly in love with them. And then there are other times when you think they're a complete bastard, they're a complete bitch. You can't understand how they treat you the way they do. You can't understand why you feel the way you do towards them. It's because we've got different characters in play at different times, and it's not until we can learn why we developed these characters and where they came from and what needs they're trying to meet for us that we can get underneath it and solve the problems they're causing from the root. And before we move on to talk more about the anger and rage part, this episode is mainly focused on Will Smith and rightly so, I think, because that's the most fascinating part. But I can't leave this bit without mentioning Chris Rock, because when we're talking about multiple personalities, I don't know if Chris Rock has done any developmental work, any therapy work or coaching work or anything of this nature. Whether or not he's done any, his reaction to what happened was out of this world phenomenal. I can't speak highly enough of the level of control he has got, and it is the control that comes from, it's a great example of whether or not he's done this work. If you want to do this work to change your life, it's a great example of how practicing whatever we do is the most important thing. Really powerful practice in really high-powered situations, high-tension situations. He will have done thousands and thousands of gigs. He will have dealt with thousands and thousands of hecklers and lots of very difficult challenges. I'm sure that is probably the most difficult challenge he's faced in context, given the profile of the event, the profile of the person who hit him. For him to gather himself, watch it. I know other people have talked about this. I'm not the first person. When you see him mutter the words, I could, or something like that, you can see the potential for the mic to change. If he is not consciously controlling who's in control of his system, who's on the mic, his subconscious just takes over there. And one of his darker characters would just jump in, like Will Smith has, in fairness. And instead what's happened is he has taken conscious control of it, and he's balanced it, and he's moved on. It is a phenomenal example of how to do this work and how to nail it. And after the Chris Rock love-in, I keep threatening to go into this with you. So the fourth crucial thing that everyone's missed is, and this is huge in life, this was a game changer for me when I learned this, because I used to have a big problem with rage, and my whole life I referred to it as anger until I learned what I'm about to share with you. When Will Smith's character version of him sits back down after slapping Chris Rock and he starts screaming the "keep my wife's name out of your mouth" part, that is for me his rage character. He has lost all control, but people refer to that as anger. I've seen a few different takes on this where people are referring to it as being anger. People will talk about anger management issues and things like that. It is absolutely crucial that we stop referring to things like this as anger, because that's part of the problem. What we are witnessing there is not anger, it is rage. And the way I like to describe rage is the unhealthy manifestation of suppressed anger. This is where the dots all start to join up with the stuff we've been talking about. When you go back to childhood and the programming we've had, part of the unhealthy programming we've all had, or most of us have had, is to suppress our emotions, especially the emotions we've been told are bad, like anger, fear, anxiety, jealousy. We've been told that these are not good, so we've been taught to suppress them. Again, that's a whole topic in itself that I'll link to in the notes. For the purposes of this, what we're seeing live in action is suppressed anger turning into rage. Think about it like this. If you've got a bucket, and the bucket, every time you suppress anger, so every time you bite your tongue, every time you bite your lip, every time you roll your eyes, every time you huff and puff, every time you tolerate, every time you don't say what you really want to say, every time you're not the real version of you, every time you just bite something down, the bucket fills up a tiny bit. Now, the key of this is there's only one bucket. We don't have a different bucket for work and a different bucket for our love life and a different bucket for Oscar ceremonies and for listening to jokes by comedians. We have one bucket, and that fills up slowly over time if we suppress our anger. When that bucket is full, whatever happens next that we suppress our anger, it makes the bucket overflow, and that's when we go from anger to rage. The unhealthy manifestation of suppressed anger. It's where the phrase "the straw that broke the camel's back" comes from. That's what we're seeing live in action with Will Smith. Think about it. How do you go from being laughing 30 seconds or a minute before to that rageful in such a short space of time? It's this slow build up over time, and something hits you and you go. It used to happen in my life, and if it's happened in yours, you will have seen a similar thing. People will often say your reaction to that incident is not proportionate to the incident itself. And that's where the straw that broke the camel's back is so key for this. Because if we're only looking at the straw, if we're only saying, well, the camel should be able to carry that last straw, we're not looking at the wider context. We're too zoomed in. We need to zoom out. This reaction by Will Smith is not just about that one joke that Chris Rock told. That was just the straw that broke the camel's back. That was the last bit of suppressed anger that made him boil over. There will be all kinds of other things going on in his life where he is suppressing anger, and that's leading to this manifestation. The way around that is to stop suppressing anger. And by the problem with the referring to incidents like this as anger outbursts is it reaffirms in our mind that anger is bad. So if we already think anger is bad and then we do something like that and we think that's anger, well, now we want to suppress anger even more. It keeps us stuck in a vicious loop. The way out of it is to express our anger in healthy ways, allow ourselves to feel anger, because there's nothing wrong with the feeling and emotion of anger. As I say, there's a whole episode on that from a while ago. I might do a new episode to update it. I'll link to that at the end and in the notes if you want to dig into more detail about it. There's a whole section in that which is fascinating about the difference between covert and overt rage. So overt rage is what we've seen. It's what I've experienced in my life, which is an outburst of physical aggression. That is something people would always associate with rage. When I say it, it's like, yeah, if you've experienced that in your life, I'm sure you'd say, yeah, rage, that's me. If you know someone like that, you're like, yeah, rage. But covert rage exists as well, which is very, very powerful. We haven't got time to get into it now. Check out that episode if you want to see more about it. And the last thing to note on the rage point goes back to something I touched on before, is that think about this physically and logically. This is where the work I do, I love, because it combines psychological, emotional work with real life practical stuff and logical stuff, and it helps us to connect those dots. It's not so woo-woo. When I talk about the two different characters, the character that actually slapped Chris Rock and the character that was sitting down and screaming at Chris Rock, if the character that's sitting down in rage was the one that hit Chris Rock, he'd have knocked his head off. At the very least, he'd have knocked him down. Think about the size of the two men. This is not something very many people have got into. I looked this up because I wanted to see. Chris Rock is about 5'10" and weighs about 3 stone less than 6'2" Will Smith. If they were boxers, they would be 2 weight divisions apart. They would not be allowed to fight each other in professional boxing because Will Smith is too big. Chris Rock, for the most part, stands flat-footed with his hands behind his back. He doesn't defend himself. And yet Will Smith, having a free hit at him, barely touches him. Think about this. Chris Rock, a few other people have mentioned this, Chris Rock doesn't even touch his face afterwards. He's just been hit by someone who's 3 stone heavier than him and 4 inches bigger than him, and he doesn't even touch his face. That, for me, is a performance. Again, we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. The rage character, once the bucket is overflown and rage explodes, it's like a volcano erupting, if you've ever felt that. I know I've felt it. If that character had punched him or hit him, even a slap, it would have been a very different outcome. So it's a good job that the two characters existed the way they did and took the turns the way they did. Which then leads us to the 5th crucial thing that no one talks enough about. Look, this is, in all the stuff I do, there's so much that I love, and there's a few very key things that if I could just click my fingers and have everybody know at once, this would be one of them. One of the biggest scourges on our planet today, in our civilizations, in the societies we've built, is black and white thinking. And we see that loads. It's actually massively apparent in Will Smith's life, in his programming from when he was a kid, all the way through his story in his book, which is fascinating. It will almost certainly be apparent in your life. It was in mine. It's something I've had to work a lot on. And that is the idea that the world wants us to always put things into one of 2 categories, 1 or 2 camps. In your own life, well, even think about race. We're either black or we're white. Politics, you're either Republican or Democrat or Labour or Conservative. You're gay or straight, you're man or woman. All of these different things, we tend to be forced to try and pick one of 2 things. And life loses its nuance. And the beauty of life and the complexities of life means that the world is nuanced. There are lots of different angles to everything. In this situation, there are a few different things I've heard people talking about. At a very basic level, are you on Will Smith's side or are you on Chris Rock's side? Then beyond that, was it staged or wasn't it staged? I've seen all kinds of people debating this. Is it right or is it wrong? Is the joke offensive? Is the joke not offensive? Should we be able to hit somebody if they tell an offensive joke or not? All of these questions, all of these deliberations are black and white. One of the keys to overcoming this problem, and that's why this raising it in such a high profile instance is helpful, because we can talk about it. Think about this in your life. The key is to move away from black and white thinking into something I call scaled thinking. So instead of thinking of things as black or white, think of it as a scale, 0 to 100, with 0 being one end of the scale and 100 being the other end. One of the things I talk about most is whether something's true or false, can we believe it or not. Very few things in life, once you boil them down, are either 100% true or 100% false. So with the stage thing, again, joining the dots of the different parts, think about it like this. What do we mean? The language, again, is very important. When we say is something staged, what we mean probably, and this is important if you're having this discussion with anyone, is say, what do you mean? Let's make sure we're talking about the same thing. Something staged to me is pre-arranged, pre-planned, everyone was in on it, or at least Will Smith and Chris Rock were in on it. And I don't think that was the case, judging various different elements of it. At the same time, do I think it was a full-on punch, a full-on slap? No. I think it's nuanced, all the stuff we've already discussed. I don't think it's fully staged. And at the same time, this is really important, the use of the word and in things. To give you a little trick, whenever we're talking about things, our language patterns keep us locked in black and white thinking, two things can't exist at the same time. We'll use the word but a lot. It's this, but this. If we switch the word but, a very simple language trick, to and, now we're subtly telling our brain that two things can exist at the same time. So I don't think it was staged. And at the same time, I don't think it was a full attack. I don't think it was a full hit. I don't think it was a full slap. Definitely wasn't a full punch. Those two things can exist at the same time. You can agree with some of the things Will Smith might think or do, and at the same time agree with some of the things Chris Rock might say or do. You can agree with both sides. You can think and move and change your mind. This is absolutely crucial in changing patterns in your life and getting beyond this world of everything being black and white. And that leads us to another big one. This is a bit you might not want to hear if you've never heard me talking about it before. Why do things offend us? Why did what Chris Rock say offend Will Smith so much that he was prepared to do what he did, subconsciously or not? What's your view on it? Why is that your view? Here's the kicker. Basically, whatever offends us is not because of the outside world. It's because of what's inside us. All the outside world is, in very basic terms, is a mirror reflecting back at us. This is all goes back to shadow work that was originated by the psychoanalyst Carl Jung. And at its heart, it's because since we were little, again, tying in from stuff I said earlier, we've been burying parts of us we were programmed to think weren't good enough. We've been burying them in the part of us that is referred to as the shadow. So this is, you may have heard about this talked about in the personal development and self-help worlds, shadow work. When we are offended by something, it's because it's something buried in our shadow. It's got nothing to do with the outside world. When you've done enough of this work, nothing offends you anymore. One of my favourite examples of this a long time ago was in a different context, but it works for the purpose of this, was that if I hold out a spider in front of a group of people, let's say there's 10 people, and let's say 5 people are afraid of the spider and 5 people aren't. The 5 people who are afraid of the spider think the fear comes from the spider. But there are 5 people who aren't afraid of the spider, which means the fear can't come from the spider. It's the same with being offended. If someone says something and 5 people are offended and 5 people aren't, or in the case of something like this, 500 million people are offended and 500 million people aren't, the thing itself cannot be objectively offensive Because if it was objectively offensive, everybody would be offended. The reason you are offended by something, if you are offended by this, by anything else, is because it's something buried in your shadow. And as a general rule of thumb, the things that are buried in our shadow, the things we don't like seeing in other people, the behavior we don't like in other people, are things that we either do ourselves and we've repressed so much because we're ashamed of it and we've been taught to be ashamed of it that we can't see it. And or it could be both of these things or either of them. If it's not something you already display yourself, it's something that if you're completely honest with yourself, you would like to be able to do, and you don't because you've been taught it's bad, you should be ashamed of it, and you suppress that. That's it in a nutshell. You might, if you've never heard this before, you might be sitting there thinking, that's a load of nonsense, Paul, it's bullshit. I can guarantee you, once you get into it, once you see it for the first time, it is life-changing. It stops you from seeing everything as being offensive, of being angry and irritated about everything. It starts you looking at your own darkness instead of focusing on everybody else's and everybody else's problems. Something that was fascinating for me was I'd been meaning to read Will Smith's book for a while, and this just prompted me to do it. It was co-written by an author I really like and a blogger called Mark Manson. When I looked at the reviews of the book just to flick through before I bought it, the number of people who read it and then said, as a result of reading the book, they now dislike Will Smith because their interpretation of his book was that he was egotistical, he was a prick. When I read it, all I saw was vulnerability, honesty, someone brave enough to face his darkness and to admit the dark sides of himself. And it was really interesting because all those other people saw a completely different thing. And that is because it's what's inside us that's important, not what's happening in the outside world. This is huge. If you want to change your life, if you choose to try and change your life, it helps you to take control of things because all of a sudden you stop being a victim. You stop thinking that the world needs to change for you. A huge quote that I love in this is a quote by Anthony DeMello, which says something like, if it's peace you're looking for, better to wear a pair of slippers than to try and carpet the whole world. And that's referencing this stuff. You look after yourself, you look after what's going on inside you, all of a sudden you're immune to whatever's going on the outside. That's the emotional psychological bit. Think about it logically. And this is something that fascinates me about the world in which we now live, which we'll talk about at the end of the episode. But think about it logically. If nobody's ever allowed to say anything because one person might be offended by it, then by definition, nobody can say anything of any note. Everything will become bland because you will always find someone that's offended by something. It's crazy. If you have any element of public life, if you post on social media, if you do videos like this, if you do podcasts, you will know that. If you've ever shared an article online, there will always be someone who finds something to be offended by in something you say. Well, what that logically means is if the person who's being offended is the one everyone has to look after, which is, think of that quote, that's carpeting the whole world. If we need to carpet the whole world to look after everybody so nobody can ever be offended, well, nobody can ever say anything, including you and including me. And not only can you not say anything, you always need to be checking whether something you want to say offends somebody because you don't know what's offensive to somebody else. Instead of that, logically, it makes more sense that we all just put on our slippers. And when we put on our slippers, we don't need to worry about carpeting the whole world because it doesn't matter anymore. It's why, to me, it doesn't matter what the context of the joke was. We're going to go into that in the last bit. But the context of the joke doesn't matter because it doesn't matter how offensive it was to somebody. It's not okay to stand up and hit them. That's just not okay. And tied into all of this is a little side note which I loved in this. If you noticed in the acceptance speech that Will Smith refers to Denzel Washington, and he says that Denzel Washington said to him something along the lines of beware because at your highest moment, that's when the devil will come for you. And in the context of this work, the devil is your ego. And in my interpretation of all this stuff, the ego is effectively all of the characters that we have built, our subconscious has built over time. There's the true version of us, the real original version, and then there's all these characters. That's the ego. And for the purposes of this, that's the devil. The devil is trying to get you to be something and do something that you're not meant to be and you're not meant to do. It's trying to keep you trapped in a dysfunctional and unhealthy way of being, trying to keep you away from being who you're truly meant to be. And if you ever heard me or watched me before, you will know, or if you've read my book, you will know I love movies. I love movie quotes. I love lessons through movies. And I rewatched the other night for the first time in a long time a classic, The Usual Suspects. Go and watch it if you've never seen it. And there is a classic line in that movie that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. And I was watching that and I thought, do you know what? I like to adapt things as well. And I actually think the greatest trick the devil ever pulled, and for the purpose of this, the ego ever pulled, is convincing each of us that he only exists in other people. So we only ever look and see darkness in other people. We don't see the darkness in ourselves. That is the greatest trick the devil ever pulled. And the way out of that is to look inside yourself and see where in you all of these behaviors that you are judging in other people. When you can face that, when you can face your own demons, when you can face the devil, that's the way through this and the way to peace and contentment. Which leads us into the seventh and final part of the crucial things people have missed. And that is that at the end of the day, our lives are just a series of stories that we tell ourselves. Stories that we tell ourselves about the past, stories that we tell ourselves about the future, stories that we tell ourselves about what's happening right now in our world. What's happening externally is completely different to the story we're telling ourselves internally. I've completely transformed my life in the last few years, and everyone I know who's done the same thing says the same thing, which is the outside world didn't really change in all that time. We've created this world in which we're constantly expecting everyone else to change, everything else to change around us. It's ridiculous. It doesn't even make any logical sense. Just stop and think about that for a second. If that's you in your life, if you're waiting for people around you to change, for the world around you to change before you can live the life you want to live, what are the chances of that happening? Has it ever happened before? You've got no control over that, zero control, and yet that's what we're all trying to do. There is, again, we could talk for hours and hours about that topic in itself. Ultimately, this comes down to us and what's going inside us. So all of this, including this analysis, this episode, including I've seen body language analysis, I've seen loads of people talking about it, psychoanalytics, psychotherapists, no matter what it is, these are all just stories. Everything you just heard me say, just stories. I remember when I'd first started learning about all this stuff and I loved it and I was passionate about it. I was talking to someone about it. And they just said to me in a message, this quote's actually on the back of my book. I loved it that much. They said to me, bore off with your psychobabble bullshit. And it cut me deep inside because it hit me in a couple of different ways from my past. But when I reflected, I was like, they're right. This is all psychobabble bullshit. Like loads of this stuff I'm talking about, the shadow work goes back to Carl Jung. Carl Jung was just a mad fella. He was just a man who came up with ideas. Sigmund Freud was just a man who came up with ideas. All of this stuff you're hearing is just a continuation of ideas that humans have come up with over time. When we analyse someone's behaviour, when we now analyse their words, when we analyse their body language. I was watching a great body language video today, and don't get me wrong, I love it. I think it's brilliant. I think this stuff's brilliant. I think it's all great. And at the same time, I hold it loosely because the body language analyst reminded me of, I went for a job years and years ago. This is about 25 years ago now. I remember a guy at the front room talking about this. He said, someone will say, oh, that person slumped in their chair and therefore that means this. And he said it happened to him at something. And he said, no, the only reason I'm slumped in my chair is because I've got a bad back. I hurt my back playing football at the weekend and I can't sit up straight. And all of these things factor into all of this. So this, tying it all together, go back to the black and white thinking. Whenever people are trying to get us to view things in a certain way, people will do this. People have done this to me. What do you think about that incident? What they're actually looking for, if they're going to express themselves properly, is, can you sum up what you think in 30 seconds? look at the length of this. I could talk about this incident for another 4 hours to really get into the details of it. But we live in a world where everything is just hot takes, snapshots, boiled down, black and white thinking, no nuance. We can add different layers of the story, and as I add to the story, as I change it, you might change what you think. It ties into something amazing that I learned in a book called Letting Go by David Hawkins, which is definitely worth adopting in your life if you don't know this already, is instead of calling something your opinion, my opinion, call it an opinion. So everything I talk to you about, everything I share, everything that's in this episode, they're opinions I currently hold. They're an opinion. The difference between calling it an opinion and my opinion is as soon as we call it my opinion, we're attaching ourself to it. We're attaching our self-worth to it. It's why we see many people, millions of people around the world now, once they've taken a position on something, they will not change because it's attached to them now. If we call it an opinion, what it does is it allows us to say, I've changed my mind. I now believe a different opinion. I've learnt some new information. I'm open to learning new information and changing my mind about stuff, because ultimately these are all just stories that we're telling ourselves. And if we change the stories, we change our perception, we change our lives completely. Which brings us to the end of all of this. And I mentioned at the beginning why I don't usually get involved in this world. And generally in my life over the past few years, I've slowly been, I don't watch TV, I don't watch the news, I've slowly come off social media. Because this stuff, the world we've created, this incident, and actually the more I've learned about Will Smith through listening to his autobiography and watching this in closer detail, this incident sums up to me why we're in the mess we're in as a society. Because where this all comes back to, and Will Smith gets to this conclusion in his book himself, is that, and all the work I do, it all comes down to the root cause of everything being we feel like we're not good enough. All of us. We've got low self-esteem, we've got low self-worth, because we've been taught since we were kids that a part of us is just not acceptable. We've internalized that. We've got deep levels of shame. We don't feel like we're good enough. The problem with the world we've built and the world of celebrity that we adore as a society is that when you take a human being that has got chronic low self-worth, they do not feel good enough, and then they have a talent. So they're a good actor, they're a good singer, they're a good sports person, they're good at business, they're good with numbers. What you do with those two things combined is create a superstar, because that person will not stop trying to prove themselves at a much lower level than Will Smith. I have been that person, so I'm speaking from experience. Nothing was ever good enough. Why? Because you always need more money, you always need another car, you always need a different girl or a different boy or a different partner. Nothing is ever good enough. But what we've done is we've created a society, and we're all complicit in this. We've created a society where we elevate the people with chronic low self-worth to the top, because they got to the top through driving themselves there. Not always, there's nuances to this, it's not black and white, but many of these people, they drive themselves to the top because they don't feel good enough and they're trying to prove themselves. Then once they're at the top, we put them on a pedestal and we use them. Think of the world we live in now. People like Will Smith in particular, they give advice to other people on social media. They give motivational talks and they talk about how you should live your life and how I should live my life. And all of it is deeply flawed. I used to love that world. I used to love the personal development world. I used to, the drive and the ambition. These are all just code words for self-hate. They're all ways that we're trying to desperately prove to ourselves that we're good enough. And by idolizing people and putting them on these pedestals and trying to emulate them, we create this dysfunctional society. And then when they do something that we don't think is acceptable, we then tear them down and we stay in this loop, this mad loop of judging other people for being flawed human beings. Something I love about Will Smith in all of this, having listened to his autobiography now especially, and I should say before I say this bit, actually, I've always liked Will Smith. When I was growing up, it was, he was the pop star version. Then there was the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which I loved. I've always loved him as a movie star. I love some of his movies that other people hate and I've always panned. And at the same time, notice that, and at the same time, I don't think it's acceptable to hit somebody for telling a joke. We literally have laws that stop you doing that. So there are some lines in this, again, nuanced thinking. We have some implied contracts in life, like if you go to a comedy show and someone tells a joke, you're not allowed to hit them. And we have some agreed contracts called laws between us all, that you're not allowed to hit someone for saying things you don't like. So I don't think it was acceptable what he did. At the same time, I still really like him. And whilst he's an example of how dysfunctional our world is and the societies we've built are, he's also an example on the other side of it, of this work, and how I have a lot of respect for someone like Will Smith, who at his level of life, with his public standing, he has had the courage to look at himself and to focus on himself and to face his darkness. And what we've seen live playing out in one of the biggest stages in this crazy world we've built is him being a flawed human being. And that's what we all are at the end of the day. We are all flawed human beings. And the more you can have compassion for other flawed human beings, by having compassion for yourself, a big part of the work I do is teaching people how to be kind to themselves. You probably have no idea right now if you are if you're not comfortable in the world, if you're judging Will Smith, if you're judging Chris Rock, if you're judging Jada Pinkett Smith, whoever it is you're judging in your life, that is a sign that you are judging yourself deep inside. And the way out of this, the way to peace and happiness and contentment, is to face your own darkness. This is the counterintuitive part of this. It's to face your own darkness, like, in fairness to Will Smith, he has been doing in his life. It is an example of how tough this work can be, because he's been doing this for a long time and still on the height, the biggest stage, under that intense pressure. He reverted to some old personality types as far as my interpretation goes. These things happen. As I say, it's happened to me on a much smaller scale, so I can empathise. I would urge you to do the same thing. And at the same time, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. People in my position, people who are coaches, people who are in the personal development, self-help world, they will often tell people all the time, you should be doing work, you should change your life, you can change your life. And while I believe anybody can change their life, if you want to change your life, if you want to overcome problems, you can. What Will Smith is showing here is another great lesson, which is this stuff is tough. Like, if you've got problems in your life and you want to change, it's not easy. Don't listen to this. There's all this bullshit that you can change your life in 3 days. You can change your life over a weekend. You can learn stuff quickly. You can have breakthroughs. You can have transformations. Yes, of course you can. But if you want to change your life, it is a commitment. It's like no different to staying in shape. It's a commitment to working on things consistently, being kind to yourself, going through this stuff day by day, making mistakes, being messy, stopping judging yourself, being kind and compassionate to you, being kind and compassionate to other people without a free pass. This doesn't mean we can just run around pissing on other people's lives. This doesn't mean we can go run around doing what we want. But being compassionate to ourselves when we make mistakes, being compassionate to other people when they make mistakes, is absolutely crucial. As I say, I could talk about this stuff for hours on end. If you did like any of that, if you want more detail on any of the topics we talked about, if you want to dive deeper into it, I will link to other episodes of this channel in the description below. There is also links to free chapters of my book, How to Solve Any Problem in Life, and some free training if you want to go into even more detail. It's all free. You can dive into it as much as you want. If you sign up for anything through my stuff with your email address, all it does is add you to my mailing list, which you can unsubscribe from at any time. And that mailing list is just sharing more free stuff with you. I just want to get this out to as many people as I can, because I truly believe it can help you to change your life. If you want to, you need to make that decision for yourself. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was a different angle than you've seen before on all of this madness. If you did like it and you're watching this on YouTube, please just click the like button. It helps YouTube to see that people are enjoying this content, so to share it with more people. If you're listening to it on the podcast or you fancy sharing it with someone else, please do so. Send it to anybody else you think might be interested. And I'll see you on the next episode.